The air in the clearing was so cold it felt like inhaled glass, yet the rejection decree burned hotter than the torches surrounding them. I, Kaelric Vorn, find you unworthy. I reject you, Vaelith Morcant, as my mate. The words fell like a death sentence into the snow. Hundreds of ironwood wolves held their collective breath, waiting for the inevitable. They expected the girl to crumble, to wail, to claw at the frozen earth in a desperate, soul-shredding plea for mercy. Instead, a soft sound rippled through the frost-heavy pines. Vaelith tilted her head, her pale blonde braids catching the pale blue moonlight, and let out a slow, melodic laugh. It wasn't the sound of hysteria, but of a prisoner watching the lock on her cage finally snap. She pressed one hand lightly to her chest, her posture relaxed, almost amused, as she looked at the Alpha King with profound, mocking pity. Beneath her fingertips, a faint crimson glow pulsed once, a heartbeat of forbidden energy that made the very ground beneath her boots begin to hum. Kaelric's jaw tightened. He was the apex predator, yet he felt a sudden, cold edge of inexplicable dread pierce his chest. He looked at her eyes, which were now flickering with an unnatural light. "You think you're throwing me away?" she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the wind. "Oh, Kaelric. You have absolutely no idea what you've just opened." The ironwood clearing was more than a forest floor, it was the Vornspire's altar of tradition, where a fated mate bond was considered the structural foundation of a wolf's soul. To sever it was to court a madness that usually left the rejected a hollowed-out shell. Kaelric Vorn knew the risks, but as an Alpha King, his logic was a cold, iron-wrought thing. Behind him stood Lysandra, the daughter of the Northern High Alpha, draped in reinforced obsidian armor and backed by the shadows of 1,000 waiting bayonets. She was the political alliance Kaelric needed to secure the Vornspire's borders, a queen with an army, replacing a girl with nothing. Kaelric's inner wolf thrashed against his ribs, a wild, snarling instinct that recognized Vaelith's and even as his mind discarded her. He looked at Vaelith, standing in her thin, homespun shift, appearing impossibly fragile against Lysandra's steel-clad confidence. But Vaelith's stillness was unnerving. She didn't look like a girl losing her soul, she looked like a sovereign observing a peasant's mistake. "The Vornspire requires a crown of strength, Vaelith," Kaelric ground out, his voice a jagged rasp as his wolf fought his resolve. "Logic dictates this path." Vaelith didn't look at the armored soldiers or the looming king. She simply turned toward the tree line, the crimson light beneath her skin pulsing with an ancient, terrifying grace. "Keep your crown, Kaelric," she said, her voice a calm breeze in the freezing night. "I never needed it." Not a single enforcer dared to bar her path. Edra's folk watched her vanish into the dark, his hand trembling as he realized the ironwood pack hadn't just lost a mate, they had lost their anchor. Welcome to Bound to the Alpha. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Vaelith's awakening. The moment Vaelith's boots crossed the invisible line of the ironwood pack boundary, the world tilted. The fated bond hadn't just been a connection, it was a padlock, and with Kaelric's rejection, the key had been turned. A violent surge of crimson energy erupted from her core, flooding her collarbone and racing down her arms like liquid fire. She staggered, her breath catching in the frozen air, and slammed her palms against the rough bark of a frost-covered pine just to keep from being swept away by her own veins. As the forest blurred into a haze of blood-red light, her mother's voice surfaced from a buried memory, echoing with a haunting clarity. The bond was the cage, little Vael. You were never broken. You were contained. The truth ignited within her. The Morcant lineage were never the weak omegas the histories claimed. They were anchors, the only beings capable of filtering the toxic, feral dominion energy that every Alpha King produced. For centuries, they had been the silent filters for the dark side of power. But Vaelith was the last of her kind, and Kaelric Vorn was the most potent, most aggressive king the Vornspire had seen in 300 years. Without her to anchor his darkness, the energy was no longer being filtered, it was awakening. As her eyes transitioned into a permanent, glowing crimson, Vaelith realized the terrifying stakes. This was no longer about a broken heart, it was a choice between salvation and total extinction. The awakening has only just begun. Kaelric stood at the edge of the jagged clearing, his eyes fixed on the exact spot where the shadows of the forest had swallowed Vaelith's silhouette. He should have felt the triumph of a king who had secured his borders, the relief of a man who had traded a liability for an empire. Instead, he felt a void. It was a coldness that didn't belong to the drifting snow, but rather a structural failure deep within his own marrow. For the first time in his life, his inner wolf, a constant, roaring furnace of dominance, had gone unervingly silent. The absence of that instinctual heat left him hollowed. When he finally turned back to the court, he expected the usual gazes of fear or admiration. Instead, he found Edra's folk. His beta wasn't looking at him with the loyalty of a soldier, but with an expression Kaelric had never seen directed at himself, pure, unadulterated pity. Later, shielded by the stone walls of his private sanctum, Kaelric looked down at his hands. Beneath the skin of his forearms, the veins were beginning to pulse with a faint, sickly hue, a color that wasn't red, but a bruised, darkening shadow. He shoved the sight away, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. He had the strongest wards in the world. He had Lyssandra's armies. He was untouchable. Yet, miles away in the silent forest, an ancient tree suddenly splintered and fell without a single breath of wind to push it. The rot had begun. Stay tuned as the king's world begins to crumble. The northern border wards, ancient and ironclad, began to bleed out within hours of Vaelith's departure. It started as a frantic pulse in the air, a spiritual alarm that sent Edra's folk sprinting into Kaelric's war room without a summons. His report was a nightmare. Rabid, feral wolves were walking through the impenetrable pack boundaries as if they were nothing but smoke. They weren't fighting for land or food, they were driven by a primordial madness, an instinct older than the moon itself. Kaelric lunged forward, his fingers digging into Edra's tunic. Impossible, he snarled, though his own voice sounded thin. The wards are tied to my life force. They cannot fail unless I am dying. Edras didn't flinch. Instead, he looked directly into the king's eyes, eyes that were beginning to cloud with a dark, swirling haze. Then something is wrong with you, he said, the words a jagged edge of truth no beta had ever dared to wield. Kaelric's grip loosened as he looked down. The black veins were no longer hidden, they were visible now, crawling like ink-stained vines toward his wrists. In the suffocating silence of the room, Vaelith's mocking laugh echoed in his mind, along with her final warning. He had unlocked the cage, and the rot was his only inheritance. Mobilize everyone, Kaelric ordered, his voice hollowed of its usual resonant command. And find me the Morcant file. Now. This is bound to the Alpha. The foundations are cracking, and the king is finally looking for the truth. Kaelric tore through the Vornspire's deepest archives, his boots echoing against the cold stone as he bypassed layers of history he had once considered beneath him. He stopped before a single, level 0 restricted vault, its surface etched with a blood cipher that had remained dry for centuries, the Morcant Covenant. Without hesitating, he sliced his palm and pressed the wound to the scanner. The stone groaned, sliding open to reveal a decaying book resting on a bed of moth-eaten velvet. By the sickly, rhythmic light of the black veins now climbing his forearms, Kaelric read the script. The words were a merciless revelation: the Morcant line does not grant power. It filters the dark excess of dominion. Without an anchor, the king's power turns inward. The rod is not a curse. It is gravity. It always was. The book snapped shut, the sound like a gavel. He wasn't a god being punished, he was a dam that had just discarded its spillway. The wards are gone, Kaelric. Edras appeared at the vault's entrance, his leather armor shredded and soaked in the blood of the border fight. We are losing. Whatever you did when you sent her away, you have to undo it. Kaelric looked at his reflection in the glass case. His irises were no longer a storm-tossed sea, they were bleeding a void like black. The king was becoming the monster his people feared. Get the horses, he rasped. The hunt for the anchor has begun. Deep in the neutral forest, where the air hummed with the thrum of blood memory, Vaelith sought sanctuary within the skeletal remains of an ancient Morcant temple. The cracked stone floors and frost-slicked columns vibrated with a power that had no home. Without Kaelric to act as the conduit, the Morcant energy was a rising tide, flooding her body from the inside out. Every breath was an agony of heat. When she coughed, a spray of iridescent crimson light flecked the snow. Beside her lay the tools of a final, desperate ritual, a bone-handled knife, a vial of black volcanic ash, and her own lifeblood staining the altar. An old keeper of the ruins, her eyes clouded with centuries of grief, watched the girl tremble. If you complete this seal, Vaelith, the power will vanish. You will survive as a mortal, but the king will rot. The Vornspire will fall into the dark. I know, Vaelith whispered, her voice a jagged rasp as she gripped the hilt. He made his choice. He chose a crown over a soul. She raised the blade, her skin glowing like molten glass, ready to sever her divinity to save her life. But just as the steel touched her skin, the ruin's outer wall exploded inward in a shower of stone and shadow. If you stop halfway through this story, you'll spend your dreams wondering how it ends. If you're captivated by this journey, like and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notification bell so you never miss a moment of our story. This is bound to the Alpha. Kaelric breached the ruins not as a king, but as a ruin himself. The explosion of stone settled to reveal a monster. Black veins had colonized half his face, and his eyes were hollow voids of leaking shadow. He threw the old keeper aside with a mindless snarl and lunged for Vaelith, his body buckling as he crashed to the floor. He grabbed her arm with trembling, clawed fingers, his voice a jagged ruin of its former power. Fix it. You're the anchor. Fix the bond. Vaelith looked down at the hand bruising her skin, then into the darkness of his gaze. She did not flinch. You don't get to command a soul you discarded, Kaelric. The defiance in her voice did what the rot could not, it broke him. The Alpha King's shoulders slumped, and the first words of a broken man escaped his lips. Please. I didn't know. I'm sorry, tell me what to do. Vaelith reached into her coat and placed the bone knife into his palm, hilt first. Relinquish the Vornspire spark. Become nothing. Voluntarily. If you survive the stripping of your power, I will anchor you. If you cannot, the rot takes you tonight, and my line dies with me. Kaelric stared at the blade, the weight of his father's legacy and 3 centuries of pride clashing in his mind. Then, with a guttural roar of surrender, he drove the bone deep into his own chest. The forest screamed with him. Kaelric lay crumpled on the stone floor of the ruins, the brilliant, aggressive spark of the Vornspire Alpha gone. For the first time in his life, he felt the heavy, fragile weight of being. Merely mortal, his body shaking as the black rot began to dissolve into ash. Vaelith knelt beside him, her presence no longer a storm, but a steady, radiating warmth. She placed her hand over the jagged wound in his chest, and the forbidden Morcant blood finally began to move. It did not rush or burn. Instead, it flowed with a slow, deliberate grace, like a great river finally finding its true course after centuries of being dammed by the pride of kings. The magic did not rebuild the tyrant Kaelric had been, it forged something entirely new, a bond built not on command, but on absolute, mutual surrender. Kaelric gasped, his eyes clearing as the darkness receded. He felt her now, not as a mate to be possessed or a tool to be used, but as an endless ocean of ancient power that had chosen to be still for him. Tears carved tracks through the grime on his face. He wept not from the agony of the blade, but from the sudden, profound silence that filled his mind. The constant, warring noise of dominion had vanished. You don't have to carry it alone, Vaelith whispered, her crimson glow softening into a protective light. You never did. This is bound to the Alpha. The sacrifice has been made, and a new world is being born from the ruins. They returned to the moonlit clearing where the rejection had first shattered the night. The same frost-covered pines stood like silent sentinels, and the same torches flickered against the suffocating cold. But the power dynamic had inverted. Vaelith stepped forward into the center of the court alone, her silhouette sharp against the snow. Kaelric stood a half-step behind her left shoulder, the position of a consort, a protector, but no longer the master. As the pharaoh rogues charging the perimeter caught sight of her, Vaelith finally released her aura. It wasn't a shout, it was a tidal wave of ancient Morcant blood finally unbound. The weight of it was absolute, a divine gravity that drove every wolf on the field, warrior and beast alike, to the frozen earth. Edra's folk, who had sensed this storm before the first cloud formed, was the first to drop to both knees, pressing his fist into the snow in total submission. One by one, the rest of the Ironwood pack followed. Kaelric looked out at his kneeling people, then turned to the woman who had saved them all. In front of the entire assembly, he removed the Vornspire crown and held it out to her with steady hands. Vaelith didn't take the gold. Instead, she took his hand, pulling him upright to stand as her equal. "We don't rule with a crown," she whispered. "We anchor." The long winter ended in the same clearing where it began, but the Vornspire would never look the same again. This has been Bound to the Alpha. Thank you for following Vaelith's journey.